Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Josh Fraser Sparks, Senior Manager of Inclusive Communities at Walmart.org, and I'm so excited to be here with you today. I think about what Sloan started with this morning. Today is a day to reimagine what the future could look like. And I think this video is one of many examples that does that. This video really shows what's possible when people come together across all lines of difference to listen, to learn, to build empathy, and to do meaningful things in their communities. And this video really hits home for me the work that you all are doing each and every day, and the work that Walmart is trying to do every day. One, we're all working to make sure that the places where people come together, grocery stores, schools, athletic events, the list could go on, just a bit more inclusive. And this is really important for Walmart because Walmart, our customers and our associates look like our country along every line of difference that you can imagine. And we want our customers and associates, because of their background, to feel valued and welcomed in our stores every day. And this is just like you all want people from all walks of life to feel valued and to be a core part of the communities in which you work. And then two, I also think the video that was just shown is one of many examples, and you'll see another one in a little bit, that elevates different narratives around what coming together to accomplish meaningful things across lines of difference can do for an individual and also their community. And so with that, we are very excited to support the work of Hello Neighbor and its network, and are grateful for the work that each of you are doing every day in your communities, in the places where people come together, to make them just a bit more inclusive and a place where everyone feels as though they belong. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce to you two phenomenal speakers today for our Fireside Chat. And on a personal note, I'm a huge fan of both of the people, and I'm currently fanboying out. So prepare yourself, it's gonna be a great conversation. First is Dr. Linda Tropp. She is a professor of social psychology at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And for more than 2 decades, she has studied how members of different groups experience contact with each other and how group differences in status affect cross-group relations. Her work seeks to foster positive relations between groups while achieving ever greater levels of societal equality and justice. Dr. Tropp has received distinguished research and teaching awards from the Society of Experimental Social Psychology and the International Society of Political Psychology. Our next guest is Wendy Feliz. Wendy is the founding director of the Center for Inclusion and Belonging at the American Immigration Council, and the center houses the signature culture and narrative change programs of the council. Wendy has been with the council since 2008 and has 2 decades of experience in public policy and advocacy communications, and she currently also serves as an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. Both of our speakers have influenced me and my strategy in building inclusive communities at Walmart.org so much, and I'm just really excited to sit back, listen, and learn today. And I hope you all are too. And with that, I'll turn it over to Wendy.
Thank you, Josh. What a lovely introduction. I feel I'm as big of a fan of yours as you claim to be of mine, Linda's. And you know, working with both Josh and Linda, they're not only colleagues, they're friends. And I think it's hard to do this work without, you know, growing in connection to each other. And that's been one of the greatest things about doing this work. I am so happy to be here with you all today on this panel with Linda, who we're going to get to very quickly because she's really who you want to hear from. I just first want to thank you all for the work that you do. I know what you do in community every day is really what matters. And so it's our job to help you think through the best strategies and the best way to move your work and your programs forward so you can accomplish the goals that you're setting out to accomplish. And, you know, having been working in the immigration space for about 13 years, I have come to realize some really important lessons. One, this is not just about good policies. We absolutely certainly need good policies in this country, but we also need to create a culture and an environment where people feel welcomed, and help receiving communities or US born folks feel like folks moving to their community benefit us, and sort of deal with the issues that do come up for people, which are often very normal around change, fears and concerns about change. And so what we hope to be able to share with you today is some of those strategies that help decrease the sense of threat and fear and increase the sense of connection and community that frankly everyone needs, no matter where they came from or how long they've lived in a community. Um, by way of just understanding how we got to this point and how I started partnering with Linda, is since 2008, I've been working at the American Immigration Council, which is a very traditional policy and advocacy organization based in Washington, DC. And working for many, many years trying to advance good policy at the federal level. And before 2016, but particularly in 2016, I really came to understand what a cultural issue immigration had become and refugee admissions had become. So I really wanted to start thinking about what are the cultural and the narrative strategies that we could begin to implement to help set up a culture that is more able to advance good policy, right? Because we know this isn't a short-term change. We know that more people are on the move in this world than ever before, or at least in our lifetimes. And that's not going to change. And so how do we really set up our nation to be okay with that idea that people will move, people will come here, and we can all be better for it? And so one of the initiatives we started working on several years ago was on the narrative piece. How do we start to advance a more positive narrative on the issue that come up for people when immigrants move into a community? And so we started working with the Ad Council, which is, for those of you that don't know who they are, they've been around for like 80 years. They do public service work. And this is their first effort to really work on the immigration issue. They've had a very small refugee campaign that they did several years ago. But what we decided to do with this campaign, and we're going to show you one of the public service ads in just a second, was really figure out who do we need to talk to, who needs persuading or who needs calming on the issue of refugees and immigrants. And we really targeted an audience that we realized needed the most attention, so to speak, needed the most thinking, to do the most thinking around this issue. But what we came to realize really early in our research, that absolutely certainly immigrants need to feel like they belong in their community. But with communities changing so rapidly, the US born folks needed to feel like they still belonged in their community because things were changing. And so when we devised this campaign, we really thought about it as creating a strategy that created belonging for everyone. That in fact, belonging is a two-way street, right? We often think of refugee resettlement as the native born or the US born population bringing in, taking in, supporting, helping refugees get settled. And it absolutely is. But there's also a piece of this where we have to think about the receiving community and how we help the receiving community also adjust to the changes that could be taking place in a community. If we're not working in New York or Los Angeles or in Chicago, a lot of places are very, very new to resettling people from other countries. It could be a 10-year, it could be just a 20-year phenomena. And so rather than just leaving people to their own designs, there are things we can do to help communities adjust to this change. And that's where Linda came into the picture for me, because while I knew we could mount a beautiful media campaign, and I hope you'll agree it's beautiful, we knew that what matters is what happens in daily life, what happens on the ground in people's communities, the places where you're doing this work. And so we really turned to Linda to help us think about how do we build contact between newcomers and longstanding residents in a way that everyone feels safe, everyone feels like they're able to accomplish goals together and build their community together. And that was really important because there really is a certain segment who I'm sure you all know in communities that are not as open and willing to resettle a refugee, teach someone English, teach someone how to adapt to the culture. There are sections of our communities that are ambivalent, they're worried, they're intimidated by this, and so they're not ready to jump right in. And so our question for Linda was, help us think about what are the ways we can bring in those more nervous segments of the community and help them take their first steps in getting to know their new neighbors? And vice versa, where are the opportunities for immigrants and refugees to get to know their new neighbors who might be more ambivalent about meeting them? And so Linda's been just so integral to helping us think about these ways to engage where there's a low sense of threat and a high reward at the end, so that we start to have these really neat, enduring relationships that help us overcome our fears of one another. And Linda will explain the brain science behind that, and or what our amygdala does when we're confronted with people who are different than us. I'll leave the psychology to Linda, but it's really important for us to understand as we go out into the world and forge relationships. But before I hand it over to Linda and we get into the ground game, like what we have to do in community, I just wanted to share with you the public service campaign that we launched in December with the Ad Council, with partnership of people like Hello Neighbor, with people's help like the Walmart Foundation. We've had so many incredible partners come in to help us and say, let's help build bridges, let's help build community. So we'll show you that public service ad right now, and then I'll ask Linda to jump in once it's over.
If I could be you, you could be me for just 1 hour. If we could find a way to get inside each other's minds. If you could see you through my eyes instead of your ego, I believe you'd be surprised to see that you've been blind. Walk a mile in my shoes. Walk a mile in my shoes. Yeah, before you abuse, criticize and accuse. Walk a mile in my shoes. Walk a mile in my shoes. Well, before you abuse, criticize and accuse. Walk a mile in my shoes.
Wow. You know, each time I watch that video, it just, I'm so touched by it. And I'm also so touched by the warm reception that I've received by Hello Neighbor to be part of this convening. Thank you so much for inviting me. Also, thank you to Wendy and Josh for the incredibly kind and generous introductions. What I'm basically going to do today is give you kind of a crash course on intergroup contact research. What do we know from the academic scholarship and science on what happens, or what is the potential to happen when we bring members of different groups together? So I'm just going to share my screen so I can walk you through some slides, because you know we academics love our slides. I hope it'll make it a little easier for you to get a sense of the type of research that's out there that might inform some of your efforts in your communities. So just by way of introducing this research literature on intergroup contact, I first wanted to just define what we mean by intergroup contact. And what we basically refer to by intergroup contact is when members of different groups have opportunities for meaningful face-to-face interactions with each other. And part of why I'm emphasizing that it's face-to-face interaction is because sometimes in other disciplines, people would refer to contact as just having people from different groups or communities in the same space. But we want to make sure that they're not just kind of coexisting, but members of different communities are actually interacting with each other. And what we feel this does is that through having that interaction, people can become more psychologically invested in the welfare and the perspectives and the experiences of members of other groups. That is, by having people share their life experiences, share their stories, we just get to know people in a deep way instead of a more superficial way, and we start to care about them and their concerns and their communities' concerns as well. So to give you a sense of the research literature on which this idea is based, a number of years ago, one of my collaborators and I, we conducted what is known as a meta-analysis. This is the type of research study where you try to find every single study ever conducted on a particular topic, and then statistically you pool all of those results into a single data set so that you can see overall, what does all of this research tell us? And so we found for this analysis, this quantitative integration of research studies, we found over 500 studies that were conducted between 1940 and the year 2000 that looked at the effects of contact. What happens when we bring members of different groups together? We collected data from over 250,000 people in 38 different countries. And based on this comprehensive data set, we find that greater levels of contact between members of different groups typically corresponds with lower levels of intergroup prejudice. That is, the more members of different groups interact with each other, the more likely it is that we'll be able to lessen their prejudice toward each other. Now, I just want to give you one brief example of a research study to give you a flavor for what some of these studies might look like. And the study that I'm going to share with you is an example from Hungary. And the reason why I wanted to use this example from Hungary is because in Hungary, negative prejudices and sentiments towards the Roma are very prevalent, very common in the population, very common in public discourse. And so we wanted to see if even in a context where there's a lot of hostility and prejudice against Roma communities, if even in that context, contact between Roma and non-Roma Hungarians could help to lessen prejudice. So to give you a sense of what we did, we partnered with an organization that sponsored what they called a living library program that's basically designed to facilitate conversations between Hungarian university students and members of the Roma community who share their experiences. And they call this a living library program because instead of like checking a book out of the library, it gives you the opportunity to get to know a person from a different group, one of the many different racial, ethnic, minority groups that is currently in Hungary. And so as part of this study, what we did is we assessed students, Hungarian students' attitudes towards the Roma before and after they participated in this program. And here we're looking at two sets of Hungarian students in particular. Some of these students met with a Roma person during their participation in the program to be able to learn more about Roma communities, about the experiences of Roma in Hungary. So that was one group of students. And then the other group of students met with members of other minority groups in Hungary and not with a member of the Roma community. So here what you can see is in this graph, you can see where it says pre-test. That's the assessments that we took of Hungarian students' attitudes towards the Roma before they participated in this program. And at post-test, those are assessments of their prejudiced attitudes towards Roma after participating in this program. And here you see different lines representing those two different groups of students that I mentioned. So the first line that I want to talk about is kind of the darker dashed line where it says Roma no contact group. That basically refers to the group of Hungarian students who did not have contact with the Roma, who met with members of other minority communities in Hungary instead. And here you can see by the flat line that their scores in prejudice towards the Roma really didn't change from when before they participated in the program to after they participated in the program. But instead, if we look at this other line, the lighter gray line that's referred to as the Roma contact group, those are the Hungarian students who actually did have these opportunities to talk with a member of the Roma community and learn more about the experiences of Roma in Hungary. And here we see that as compared to their pre-test scores that we assessed before they took part in this program, we show or we observe lower levels in prejudice towards the Roma after their participation in the program, after they've had an opportunity to learn from Roma people themselves about their lived experiences in Hungary. Now, I just gave you this example of the study conducted in Hungary as one example. And as you can kind of get the sense from this living library study, a big emphasis during this intervention was actually having members of the different groups talk about what it's like to be a member of the Roma community, right? Talk about those group differences between non-Roma Hungarians and members of the Roma community who are living in Hungary. But I just want to share with you that there are many different ways in which we can structure contact programs when we bring members of different groups together. And it's worth taking time to think about whether and when it makes sense to have us focus on those group differences during the group members' contact. And the reason why I mention this is because sometimes by focusing on group differences, or as we might call it, making group differences salient in that contact situation, sometimes that focus on group differences during contact can make some people feel uncomfortable or threatened, like they don't know what to do or they don't know how to act. So sometimes we might think about maybe reducing an emphasis on group differences when members of different groups interact, and really thinking about the role of focusing on group differences and how it might play a different role at different stages of the intergroup relationship as members of different communities are getting to know each other and their relationships develop and grow and potentially change over time, such that perhaps when members of different communities meet for the first time, that might not be the best time to really dive in to really tense or intense topics related to group differences, right? Might, in some cases, make sense to try to de-emphasize those group differences during those initial moments of interaction across group lines, so that members of those different groups or those different communities really get a chance to get to know each other and develop a sense of trust and rapport and comfort interacting with each other. And then once we've achieved a certain level of comfort or trust or rapport across group lines, then we can try to reintroduce or re-emphasize those group differences. Then once we have a basis of trust and rapport between groups, starting to talk about group differences, starting to talk about group inequalities even. And so we can also make sure that once members of the different groups have started to develop a sense of trust and rapport, that any positive experiences they have with each other will not only change how they feel towards the individual outgroup members that they interacted with in that contact situation, but that will help to transcend the contact situation, to shift people's attitudes towards those other groups overall by improving our attitudes and our feelings about interacting with members of those other groups, not just those that we encountered in the contact situation itself. So now, in addition to thinking about how we might structure one specific interaction, I also want to have us just think about some general principles that we use kind of as guidelines for setting the stage for contact when we're expecting to have members of different groups interact with each other. And as identified in the research literature, there are a few what we call optimal conditions that we would ideally like to have represented in the contact situation to maximize the potential for achieving positive outcomes from contact, to help facilitate those reductions in prejudice that we saw, like what we saw in the Hungary example. One of these optimal conditions involves establishing equal status between the groups in the contact situation, so that even if the groups have different national statuses, linguistic statuses, racial or ethnic statuses outside of the contact situation, that when they're brought together, they are treated and regarded as equals. Now, in addition to establishing equal status, we also want to establish institutional support to make sure that the authorities of our social institutions and our communities, our laws and policies and customs are all kind of reinforcing the support for equal status contact between those groups, as if authorities of our different social institutions and communities are saying, yes, you should interact with each other and you should interact with each other as equals. And then in addition to these conditions, we also want to try to establish interdependence, whereby members of the different communities or the different groups really need to work together and rely on each other in order to achieve shared goals. So by this, I mean, they're working cooperatively, not in competition with each other, but working in cooperation with each other to try to achieve their shared goals. And our research and others' work suggests that the more able we are to structure those contact situations with these types of conditions that highlight and establish equal status, highlight and establish institutional support, and have interdependent activities that allow members of the different groups to work together to achieve shared goals, the more that our contact is structured in line with those optimal conditions, the greater reductions in prejudice we tend to see resulting from the contact that the groups have with each other. Now, just to give you a few different examples of what these types of contact activities might look like. You can think about many different types of things that might serve the communities as a whole. So we can think about community cleanup days where we have racially, ethnically diverse teams, including both recent immigrants and refugees, as well as longstanding host society members working together to clean up and beautify their communities. We can think about community art projects also contributing to making their communities better and more beautiful to live in, painting murals together, conceptualizing ideas for how they want their communities to be represented on the walls and the playgrounds of their communities. And we can even think about other interactive types of community events where there might be cooking classes or dance classes where members of different communities teach each other in interdependent cooperative ways what they know, so that the representations of different cuisines and cultures are both valued and represented in those community settings. And I just want to kind of send my slides back to have Wendy talk for a moment about an example of a community project that she and her team has been involved in.
Thank you, Linda. I love listening to you. It's so great. I learn something new every time. This is an interesting pilot strategy that is happening in a rural town. So we want to make sure when we pilot stuff, it's done in bigger cities where there are lots of resources and smaller places where there aren't always as many institutional partners. And this is an example of a rural community, actually right in Walmart's backyard in Knoll, Missouri. And it is a meatpacking town. There's a Tyson's meatpacking plant there, and it's a relatively new phenomena there, maybe in the last 10 years. So there's been a large community of refugees who have moved into Knoll. And there weren't really any sufficient bridging strategies between the longstanding residents and the newcomers. And so we have been talking with them, and our friends at Welcoming America have also been working with them critically to think about what are these, how do we flatten power out? So everybody's working towards a common goal, just like Linda said, no one has more power over the other person, and we're working towards the common good. And what the folks in Knoll came up with was a couple of strategies, but this is one of them, which was a community garden strategy. And a lot of universities in states across the country have extension programs where they'll come in and they'll actually help you with agricultural projects, and they're very happy to do it. So the local extension program came in and helped the folks at Raise Knoll develop this community garden project. So as you see here, there's just people in the garden. They're not talking about what makes them different. They're not fighting about politics. They're not, doing anything other than taking care of the garden, building the garden together. It's something that they will all benefit from. And what else is really important is think a lot about, as you're developing your strategies, shape them in a way so that they're sustainable and it's not a one and done strategy, but actually you got to keep coming back to this garden, right? You got to keep planting the seeds and tending to the flowers and the food. And so this is going to give people multiple opportunities for contact, and it's going to continue to build their sense of trust and connection, right? Even if you don't have, the opportunity to even share a common language, you can say, you know what, this guy has a green thumb. I don't care where he's from. He has a green thumb, and, I have respect for him. And this starts to raise these feelings of warmth, this sense of competence, this sense of care for the community. And these are the things that we need to cultivate in order to help people overcome prejudice. But I think this is a great example of the really important theory that Linda is providing in practice.
And if I could just follow up on that, and I'll stop sharing my screen. I think some of those words that Wendy was sharing about this community gardens example, about planting a garden and tending to the seeds, is actually a really good way to think about intergroup contact and relationships between groups, right? We need to kind of plant the seeds to make that contact happen, but then we need to tend to that garden. We have to sustain our involvement and sustain that communication across group lines to sustain whatever trust or rapport has developed between groups.
Are we going to Q&A now, I think?
I think so.
Okay, that's great. While we're queuing up some questions, I'll just say the other project that they actually did in this small town is a mommy and kids project, where what they were attempting to do was to bring moms together with their young children in an environment where the kids were getting, early education support and the moms were getting a little bit of a break. And it was interesting because we were testing the strategy and it wasn't the white working class moms weren't showing up as much as the refugee moms were. And so the folks at Knoll were really smart and they said, okay, I'm not sure what the barrier is here, but this isn't working. But what could we do to make sure that the refugee community is being connected to the US born community? And then they pivoted to the retirement home. And they started asking the folks in the retirement home to come and help with the kids. And they were into it. And so then what you were doing was you were building bridges with the elderly community and the refugee community and the kids. And not only were they growing in contact with the refugees, but a mom had said, it was mostly Sudanese refugees who were living in this town. A mom had said to us that my children were afraid of white people. And having this experience decreased their fear. So there's just a lot of mutual fear across communities because they just haven't had an opportunity to see each other in these very humanizing ways. And so sometimes it's easier than we think. We get really complicated and thinking about how hard this has to be. And I actually think it's more intuitive if we just pay attention to what the community needs and try to meet those needs together.
So it looks like we have a first question from Leah asking from North Dakota, how do you successfully get ambivalent host community members to feel safe or encouraged to participate in intergroup contact? I think that's a great question. And I know one that Wendy and I have thought about quite a bit. Just to share a brief reflection, and then Wendy, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Oftentimes, and there's a whole research literature to support this too, but oftentimes there's a general tendency for people to anticipate the worst when they expect to interact with members of other groups. So we kind of have all these built up expectations of how bad it's going to be, how uncomfortable it's going to be, how different we're going to be from each other. We have all these kind of preconceived notions of all bad that could happen. And it's harder for us to envision what good could come out of it. And so I think oftentimes getting people to just say, well, sometimes we go see a movie that we don't necessarily like, or, we go try something, learning a new sport, learning a new language. We try all of these other things in our lives. Why not just try this and see how it goes? And even sometimes, when we're trying to learn a new language or a new sport, we might say, I'll give it like a month. I'll give it a few lessons and then I'll make a decision, right? And usually by that time, after trying for a few times, we don't have so much fear or discomfort around it. We're starting to feel a little bit more comfortable. I think that might be one strategy, to just say like, why not try it? Let's just see how it goes. And I think also related to that, maybe getting your friends to go too, right? So you don't feel like you're the only one, but it's something that you and other folks, you can kind of do together, interact with different people while you're in that contact setting, and maybe talk about what the experience was like afterward, to normalize it, to make it seem a part of what we do in our community. But Wendy, do you have thoughts you'd like to share?
Yeah, really simply, all I would add to that is, if you think about the example in Knoll, they didn't put up signs and say, hey, come hang out with refugees at a community garden. And they didn't say, hey, come hang out with refugee moms and their kids in a Mommy and Me project. They said, dear moms, free childcare. Do you need a break? Come on in. And like, what mom wouldn't be like, on my way, right? And they said, let's build a garden together. If you like gardens, come down. And so what that really speaks to is our shared identity. If I'm a gardener, I'm a gardener. I love gardening, I'm going. If I'm a mom and I need a break, I'm going. And so I think what happens is sometimes we default to thinking we actually have to highlight the identities that make us different. And what I'm saying is, connect people across the identities that bind them and don't call attention to the identities that divide us. And then someone had written in the other chat, how do you do this in COVID? Beautiful question. Very carefully is the answer. And you don't do some of it. So there's been a delay in some of our work. But I think what we'll be coming back to is, if you're doing a garden and you're outside and you're vaccinated and you're wearing a mask, you're probably okay to do your garden. And so we just have to you're right, there's an additional threat that's been activated for people around the virus. And so we have to take that into account. So that's a really smart point. And then I think the next question is for you, Linda, from Andrea.
I actually wanted to add one thing to what you were saying, and that is about like the self-interest component. There's actually a fair amount of research, especially with kids in like integrated classrooms, that shows that because we know that human beings are self-interested beings, it's actually not always a bad thing to encourage interdependent activities as a way of helping people achieve their self-interested goals, right? So that's why you might want to think about community gardens that provide fresh produce for your community, thinking about community beautification projects, thinking about what goals does this community already have that we can kind of scaffold onto by providing the space and opportunity to work toward those goals. And as a byproduct, also get to know people who are different, also have opportunities to interact with people that they might not have interacted before, because that is often what will bring people to those events, to those convenings, to have them show up. And the more interdependent those activities are, the more you have to rely on the other person, the more that signals, oh, it's in my best interest to listen to what they have to say, because they know things I don't know, and I might know things they don't know. So by the exchanging information, we can actually help make the project better. So I would say when you're thinking about how to implement these types of programs or activities in your communities, really don't shy away from, the motivation of self-interest. It is there for the taking. Think about what goals your communities already have that they want to work on as expressed in like town council meetings or whatever it happens to be. And then think about, oh, we're going to build a new playground for our kids. That might be a strategy. We're going to, work with Habitat for Humanity or other organizations to build new housing for our longstanding community members as well as our newcomers. That might be a strategy, right? So really think about the goals and needs of the community and kind of use those to inform what types of efforts might be relevant and effective for the folks that you're working with. So Andrea looks like she has a question asking me to speak a little bit more about what institutional support looks like. There are so many systemic barriers for new neighbors. Why, yes, there are. How do you equalize the field on this point? I think that's a great question. So I was trying to be expansive in my definition of institutional support because it might take different forms depending on the communities that you're in. In some communities, you might have an advocate, right? It might be somebody in the mayor's office. It might be somebody on the city council. It might be like a locally elected representative who really wants to like use their office or use their position to try to promote the types of programs that you're trying to promote. In other cases, it might be less formal forms of kind of authority or institutional support. So for example, it could be neighborhood boards. Like I used to serve on the board of my neighborhood association, and we just as a neighborhood decided that we wanted to put up signs to promote inclusion, put up sponsoring opportunities for people to get to know their immigrant neighbors and newly resettled refugees in the community. It might also be, local organizations, like I know in my neck of the woods, Catholic Charities has been very active with a welcome home resettlement program for newly settled refugees in my community, where they've hosted like these community dinners where in part some it's like a potluck, but local residents make like their family's favorite foods, and then like the new arrivals make their family's favorite foods, and they can kind of learn about each other's cuisines and culinary practices. So I think it's trying to look for those kind of sites of energy that is willing to kind of move these types of efforts forward. But I don't know, Wendy, if in your expertise, if you have other ideas that come to mind related to that question.
Yeah, I would just add to your excellent comments, Linda, is that what we're trying to do is bring in institutions that haven't typically thought of themselves as working in this space and ask them to help. So some of our partners on the Belonging Begins With Us campaign are the YMCA, the Trust for Public Land, the Council on Christian Colleges and Universities. And so I think what we need to do is expand our own vision of who might be interested in creating a tighter community, right? Because most community-based organizations, most large institutions are. Walmart wants to build safe communities, but sometimes we go in and go, hey, do you work on refugee issues? No, okay, see you later. No, take that hat off. Put your community builder hat on and say, hey, I'm trying to build a strong community where neighbors know each other and get along. Would you like to help? And everybody's going to say, duh, of course, right? And they're going to help you. But sometimes we just frame it in our narrow way. But when we help the whole community, when we build connections, we do help refugees. That's a wonderful byproduct, but we're helping the whole community. So I would just think about unusual partners, and don't be shy to go and talk to other people about the kind of community you're trying to build and the values that you're holding and you're putting out into the world. And I bet you would find more partners than potentially you have now.
Wendy, I'm tempted to have you start with this next one, given some of the studies you've been doing. I'll just read it out in case people can't see it. What do you do if you feel threatened by another group of people because of your identity? Can you still connect with them in a meaningful and safe way?
That's such a good question. And I will say a few things, but Linda will give you a better answer. I mean, I think when we talk about contact, right, and we talk about connecting across difference, that's something we can and should do. However, if you feel unsafe, if you feel threatened, that's very different. You have to take care of yourself. We're certainly not asking anybody to put themselves in harm's way. And so I think you really have to decide individually if this is a person you can connect with, or if you're being attacked because of your whatever it is, your racial, ethnic, sexual, whatever identity. And so I think that there's extremes, but by and large, we're talking about the non-extreme spaces and opportunities where people can't connect. And I think that there are a lot of those, but obviously it's always up to a person's best self-judgment to keep themselves sane and safe.
Yeah. If I could just briefly add, I absolutely agree with what you said, Rachel. I think, sorry, I think the focus that we need to have is really on protecting ourselves. And I apologize, I saw Rachel's name come up in the question answer, Wendy, so I was primed to think Rachel. But what I also wanted to add in terms of responding is also really maybe take a moment for self-reflection, just kind of quietly with yourself and think about what types of threats are coming up for me. Because I do think, you know, if we fear that we're going to be targeted or slandered by interacting with members of another group because of the identities that we hold, because we all hold multiple identities, right? And so some members of other communities might be hostile to some of the identities that we hold dear. I would completely follow what Wendy was saying and really, you know, be a little more self-protective. However, if we find ourselves thinking about the ways in which we feel threatened, and it feels more like, I think I'll feel uncomfortable, or I think they're threatening like what I think it means to be an American, then I would say if like, that's more like what we would call, you know, other types of threat, maybe like a symbolic threat about how we think the world should be. And I think it's really a useful learning experience for us to allow ourselves to question our views of the world, and to see if we can learn anything. And just because we interact with other people and maybe can get along with other people doesn't necessarily mean that we would agree with their way of life, right? It makes sense that we would prefer how we live our personal lives, right? Because that's who we are. And we like to feel good about ourselves. That's something we tend to have as a motivation as human beings. But by exposing ourselves to other ways of being, other ways of living life beyond our own, we kind of develop what some people would call the complex word deprovincialization. But it's this idea that we become less provincial in our views, that we start to realize, you know what, there's many different ways of living life on this planet. I have my way and I prefer my way to their way, but that doesn't make their way necessarily bad. So the fact that people are different may not be so threatening. So I would just take some moments to really think about, what is the source of the threat? What am I really concerned about? Am I rationalizing that I feel threatened by them because I don't want to have my worldview questioned? Or because I don't want to feel uncomfortable? If so, then maybe try reaching out and trying something different. If I personally feel I might be attacked if I try to engage with these people, then absolutely take care of yourself, and perhaps pursue other strategies to learn about difference.
Okay, I think that there's no more questions. So maybe we should just wrap up with our final comments. Linda, should we do that?
Sure. I don't really have any final comments prepared, but I would just say, you know, I think we often, when we're approaching cross-group interactions, we're often so focused on how are we going to feel? How are we going to experience this? Those are very self-focused responses. And so I would say, you know, a lot of times we can facilitate smoother interactions if we treat these opportunities to get to know people who are different from us as learning opportunities or learning experiences. We may not love them. Sometimes they might even be hard or a little uncomfortable at first, though they do tend to get more comfortable and easier over time. But just to really, investigate, like, what might I be able to learn? How might I be able to grow, tend to those seeds beyond what I'm used to experiencing in my day-to-day life?
Excellent. The only thing, I would add, just because this has been a lesson for me to learn as an immigration advocate for so long, is I always wanted to stay focused on the immigration, story, the immigrant, the refugee, their perspective, because I felt like that was my job as an advocate, to always stay focused on them and their story. And I think what we found with this sort of a lot of Americans is they've heard a lot of bad things about immigration, right? And so they get really caught up in the bad rhetoric that's been out there in the world. And so I think when we did some of this work in preparing for the Ad Council campaign, and we were trying to talk to people about immigration, they don't like the politics of the issue. And they have been sort of seduced by a lot of these, negative stories, disinformation, mythology, sensationalism. And so I think they really want to think about it through the lens of community and neighbors, right? And they don't want anybody to feel left out. They think everybody should feel like they belong. And so what we're attempting to do is, let's let the public think about this and process this through more productive frames, like friends, like community, like neighbors, right? And what we do by doing that is we get away from the political fight that people are trying to force us into, and we're just letting people deal with each other as people. I'm a mom. I know what it's like to deal with teenagers. I know what it's like to deal with crying babies, right? I go to work every day and I work hard. Like, let's connect people across all their common, identities and struggles and dreams. And let's not intentionally disconnect them by saying, but you were born in Guatemala and you were born in South Dakota, so you must be different. In fact, no, there's so many more stories that we could focus on that help us connect. And in connecting people, what we will do is we will give the public firsthand knowledge about immigrants and refugees. And that is the strongest defense against lies, rhetoric, and disinformation, which is what they're getting. And they don't have the firsthand experience to say, you know what, that doesn't line up with my experience. And so we're really attempting to create those experiences for Americans so that they have that strong defense against the negativity and the rhetoric. So just keep thinking about that. Yes, your job is to be an advocate for refugees, to support their full, entry into society, and that they do successful, great work. And I know that's already a lot to do, just that. But I think what Linda and I are just asking you is just to put a little effort into thinking about how you can help everyone in the receiving community have experiences with their new neighbors in ways that kind of disarm them, bring the temperature down, depoliticize the issue, because that's the way we start to connect. And that's the way we really start to change the culture and calm everybody down about the fact that people are moving here, even though they've been moving here since we began our country. It's still every generation's work to keep sort of like calming people down and raising our sense of connection and care and expanding that circle of us and avoiding the narratives of them, they, all of that. So I think that's it. I think we're done, Linda. Yeah?
Yes, I think so too. Thanks so much, everybody, for listening and asking your questions. And thanks again to the Hello Neighbor Network for inviting us to participate in this fireside chat.